Welcome back, everybody. We are on to our fourth and final division here in the NHL and the NHL Trade Deadline for 2022. We're talking Pacific Division, and we've got a handful of contributors from the Hockey Writers with us to do so. We've got Austin, we've got Victor, we've got Matthew. I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves, talk about what they're working on, what's happening with their respective team towards the trade deadline, and then plug their social media or whatever they want to plug. Matthew, we're going to start with you. You're up in my left-hand corner, so it makes the most sense. I don't know what other people are seeing, but for me, you're right there. So we're going to start with you. Vancouver, lots of talk about this team. Not much action around this team. Could be because they're in a playoff position now, potentially. Could be because there was just a lot of talk that never turned into anything, and sometimes that happens. What's going on in Vancouver? What are you working on? Where can people find your stuff? What's happening there?
Well, there's really not a lot of talk lately, but that's because the Canucks are in, pulling out of the playoffs. They could be in the playoffs for the end of the night today, depending on where Vegas falls. But you can follow me on Twitter at Matthew Zator SC. Also do a lot of writing on the Hockey Writers. I host the Prospect Corner YouTube show as well. So I do a lot of prospects coverage and the draft. The Canucks are an interesting situation, I think, with their, close to the playoffs. They got some contracts that are big contracts that are probably not easy to move, like Tyler Myers. There's been talk about him. Connor Garland has been in the rumors. Brock Besser, JT Miller, not so much now because he's got a career high now, 73 points. So he's going to be probably a guy that's going to be re-signed rather than traded. So, the Canucks are going to be interesting to see what they do. I feel they're not going to do anything apart from maybe some small deals, like maybe getting rid of Jason Dickinson because he hasn't fit in here. Kicking tires on some guys. I mean, if a team goes and throws a ridiculous offer for a Besser or whatever, then you got to look at it. But we'll see. We'll see what happens in the next couple of days here.
Okay, I want to ask you about a couple of players that were sort of in the rumor mill. Some we now know are probably not going to be moved, but just the situations like JT Miller, for example. There was a lot of talk about JT Miller this season, probably dating all the way back to at least a couple months ago. And then it was pulled sort of back that Vancouver was thinking about re-signing him, and they didn't really want to trade him, but they were just seeing what the market would allow. Did you ever think that JT Miller was going to go anywhere?
Personally, I didn't think that those rumors the rumors come from somewhere, but the way he's played this year, he's been probably the Canucks' best player above everyone. Probably one of the best players in the NHL. I don't think, maybe there was some talk about at the beginning, but as he started playing and the management started seeing what type of importance he was to the Canucks, I think those talks went away. And the thing is, now, if you are going to trade him, you want a ridiculous package for the guy. And probably something that no team is going to want to pay. So I don't think he's going anywhere. I think he's a big core piece of the Canucks. Yes, he's 29 years old, but you look at what the Sedins did until they were 35. I think Miller's best days are still ahead of him. I think he can be a solid contributor to the Canucks for the next 4 or 5 years. So I don't think he's over the hill. I think he's a Canuck with an extension, personally.
Okay, what about Brock Besser? Here's a guy that we believe was probably going to be part of the Vancouver Canucks' long-term future plans, but that narrative may have changed a little bit. Do you believe he's a guy that they're actively really looking to move? Is he a guy that isn't part of their long-term plans anymore? And if he's not moved by the deadline, do you still think that he could be moved?
Besser's an interesting case to me. I think because he's on that restricted free agent this offseason, he's got a big qualifying offer. I think they want to re-sign him, but the money may not work. There's just so many contracts that they got that Rutherford has been strapped with the, coming into this team, and he's got to move out money. He's got to move out something. And Connor Garland's a candidate. That's why he's been in there to get out some money. Besser could be gone because they just can't afford him. And that's just the bottom line, especially if they want to re-sign JT Miller to that, $8-9 million, which is probably what he's going to command since Hurdle's contract screwed everything up.
Yeah. So the forward lines or the forwards that we heard out there, big names, probably aren't really going to be the guys we watch, because there's still like Claude Giroux. There's still a lot of guys out in the market that are the big names that everybody's sort of watching. And Vancouver's guys, Miller, obviously out of that conversation now. He would have been in that tier of big name people. I'm not sure if that Brock Besser qualifies. Maybe he's second tier, maybe that sort of thing. But on the blue line, there's some guys that we are sort of watching for. I mean, you mentioned Tyler Myers. Luke Shen's been a name that's been thrown out there a little bit. Do you believe that Vancouver is maybe looking to move somebody from there? Is it clearing out money for Myers? Is it actually getting a better return for Shen because maybe a team is willing to overpay a little bit for a guy like him? What are you thinking there?
Well, I mean, I mentioned Tyler Myers, and his contract is so big, and to move that type of money, especially at the deadline, is just, I don't think a team's going to want. He's still got term on his contract too, which is not ideal for teams to bring on. And he's been a really good, despite what some people say about Myers, he's actually been a really good defenseman for the Canucks this year. I mean, he still has those those turnovers you don't like, but he's played the third most minutes of any defenseman. He's a key part of the team. Unless you're getting something in return for him that's going to take on that role, the Canucks are taking a step back. So, I mean, ideally you want to move that money out, but maybe in the offseason, not now. Luke Shen is another interesting case. He's also has term. He's got one more year after this. So he was signed to a 2-year contract in the free agency. So yes, he'd be a great piece to any team because of the fact that he's won 2 cups. He was a pretty good player for Tampa in those 2 cup runs as well. So, and he's been really good for the Canucks because of, injuries, and Pullman been out and Hammond goes out at the beginning of the season. He's solidified himself as being a top 4 defenseman now for the Canucks. And he's probably one of the most physical defensemen they have too. So that'd be a big loss losing him. But I think, yeah, like you said, I think a team would overpay for him if they did put him on the market for sure.
Am I fair to say that Vancouver is probably a lot of talk and little action? Is that where we're going to classify them heading into the deadline on Monday?
Like the Canucks are always every year. There's so much talk before it, and they just never do anything unless a small trade like they did with, a Sven Baertschi type thing, these small little depth moves that probably won't do anything now, but may do something in the future. But yeah, I think it's going to be maybe some small moves. I'd be surprised if they did anything massive.
Well, it'll be interesting to watch anyway. We got a few days to find out if that's true or not. Austin is with us for Los Angeles. He covers the Kings for the Hockey Raiders. Austin, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, let people know where they can find you. Are you working on anything specific? The Kings are an interesting team. I think they're better than everybody figured they would be coming into the season. 74 points. They're right in the playoff mix. What's happening out of Los Angeles there?
Yeah, like you said, Austin Stanovich, I cover the Kings. If you want to find me on Twitter, it's Stanovich68. And like you said, they've surprised a lot of people, even myself. I had them as a playoff team coming into the year, but I thought they'd sneak in the wild card spot or kind of the third best team in the Pacific, but they've exceeded that expectation, sitting second right now. They've gotten a little help. I think Edmonton and especially Vegas really struggling, which surprised a lot of people, has helped them a lot, but they look really good. Working on right now, the Kings have been decimated by injuries in the last couple of weeks. They're getting a little help tonight with Alex Edler coming back, but that's one of their starting 6 defensemen from opening night. So they are getting killed in the back end right now. And that's kind of driven a lot of the trade talk around them right now is, can they go out and get someone to help bridge the gap between now and when they get those guys back? I personally don't see a lot happening with the Kings coming into Monday, just because they're in this awkward in-between stage where they're not ready to really make a cup run and go out and get someone who's going to push them over the edge, but they're also out of the stage where they're looking to trade some of their veteran guys to get future assets. So kind of like Vancouver, I would expect there not to be too much movement. There's maybe going to be a couple depth guys they bring in, but outside of that, I wouldn't expect much.
I don't know the Kings situation, obviously, as well as you do. Are they in a situation with their injuries where they can take advantage of LTIR, or are there most of their guys not in that situation where they expect them to return before the playoffs, so they can't take advantage of that money, or wouldn't anyway?
They're not really in a spot to take advantage of that. Their only guy on LTIR right now is Sean Walker, who gives you about $2.5 million, not much to play with. And they don't have another guy who they can put on there. They had Alex Edler, but again, he's coming back tonight, so they can't really take advantage of that.
Is there anything that you expect if they're going to be quiet for the deadline? What do you think that their maybe not short-term, midterm, long-term planning is? Like where do the Kings sit? Pleasantly surprised, we'll make a run if we can make a run this year, but what happens now after this is over in the offseason long-term for the Kings.
So all the reporting coming out of the Kings is saying they are going to look to make a really big splash this summer. It sounds like they're going to go hard for a top 6 goal scorer. They've been the worst finishing team in the league, and they need a lot of help in that department, and they need a lot of the help on the power play. They have one of the worst power plays in the league, so that's definitely something they're going to go after. And it's been a full year now that we've heard they're looking for a dynamic young offensive defenseman to help on the left side. So the rumors are coming in that they're going to go hard after someone in that mold. Jacob Chikrin's been the big name. Obviously, that's not going to happen before Monday. I don't think the Ben Chirot deal, I think, killed any hope of that happening. I mean, if that's what Ben Chirot goes for, I don't even want to imagine what Jacob Chikrin's going to bring in. So I would expect coming into the draft and maybe even into next year's deadline, you'll see some big moves from the Kings to try and push themselves to that next level, but it's going to be at that time. I actually think an interesting thing to look forward to with the Kings is, do they try and go really hard to win a cup while they sub Andre Kopitar, Drew Doughty, and even Jonathan Quick playing pretty well right now? I think that's going to be a big thing the next year.
Do you expect any of the guys they have on their current roster? I mean, when you're in a playoff position like this and you don't really want to be selling, but they got Edler, they got Mata, they got some of these guys being UFAs. Is there any chance that any of these guys move, or they just hang on to them and they take their chances with them in the offseason?
Mata, they maybe move. I think it'd be hard to find a buyer for him. He's been better recently, but he's had a pretty tough time with the Kings. I don't think there's any real urgency to trade those guys. I think they're fine holding on to them and just letting them walk. Honestly, they have such a deep prospect pool that they don't need to worry about, hey, if we lose this guy, we can't replace him or it's going to be expensive. They can just let a prospect come in and fill in for him. One guy I would have said coming to the deadline, this is a guy they might move out. Maybe they can get a couple assets for him, is Andreas Athanasiou. He was playing really well. He's hurt now. He's going to be hurt to the deadline. I can't imagine you find a buyer for him. So that's kind of off the board now.
Yeah, that was definitely somebody I'm familiar with. We had Athanasiou for a little bit in Edmonton, didn't really do much. He was supposed to be one of those guys that, helped them get into the playoff hunt, and it didn't really pan out and wound up being a disaster for the Oilers. Not that it was Athanasiou's fault, but yeah, he's a guy that he's always sort of on that radar in the background there, right? Like, can somebody add him? Can they get him to score a couple goals in a playoff run? Be interesting to keep our eyes on the King, though. I think they're a team definitely to watch. You're right. When they've got these young prospects and these good players coming up, how they mix that team together will be very interesting. Whether or not they do that at the trade deadline, I have no idea if this is going to be something that they start to tackle now or if they wait until after, but they'll be an interesting team to watch for sure. Let's switch gears over to Victor. Victor covers the San Jose Sharks for the Hockey Writers, also does a fantasy show, all sorts of fun stuff. Victor, how are you? I hope everything's going well. What are you covering with the Sharks? Where can they find you? You're working on anything specific towards the deadline? I mean, you guys just had some big news coming out of San Jose.
We sure did, yeah. Mike, you can find me at Victor Nuno 12, VICTORNUNO 12 on my Twitter. And as Jim has been on the show and Matt as well, the Fantasy Hockey Life is a podcast that the Hockey Writers supports as well. And I wrote actually a big piece on the trade deadline history. So going back at all the moves the Sharks had made. Also made my case for why the Sharks should tear it down and do a full rebuild, which they are obviously not going to do, especially with the Hurdle news. My colleague, Josh Frogelin, wrote about the Hurdle signing today, actually, so you can check that out, which I retweeted as well. That's obviously the big news, and I think that is kind of the big news going forward, is that in my mind, the Sharks refuse to realize that their core is aged and no longer really a contender, but they keep wanting to push their chips in and think they can retool and go back at it. And I just don't see it. And it's kind of frustrating to watch, frankly.
So we know how you feel about the Thomas Hurdle signing. It seems pretty obvious, but what were you thinking in terms of what they could have potentially done with a trade? Did you think that he was one of those guys that could be moved? And did you think that the return that San Jose could have got had they chosen to move him would have really set that team on the right path that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's tough to say what was out there. I think that, yes, I was in favor of trading any assets you can and rebuilding. And Hurdle was obviously the best. He's a very good player. And not to discount his quality at all, because he's a really good player. It's just that, paying 8 times 8+ for a guy who's older and could have got you. Yeah, I don't know what we could have got. It seems like the Sharks could have gotten a pretty good prospect, a good pick at least. It depends on whether it was a sign and trade or just a rental. A rental probably would have gotten a lot less. And I think that that's maybe what they were afraid of. I think they could have done a rental and maybe had him re-sign in the offseason. That would have been interesting. At least they could have got some assets for it, because clearly the Sharks still believe they can make the playoffs. I think they're delusional. But the team still believes, and they want to push for it this season and beyond.
So based on that thinking, if the San Jose Sharks believe that they are a better team than maybe they appear to be, or that a lot of people think they are and need to retool, but they're not going to do that, what do they do here at the deadline? Are they moving anybody? Are they selling anything? Are they hanging on to all these people because they believe they have a solid team and everybody on this roster is going to be useful at some point? Like what do you think their mentality is, and how do they approach the next few days here?
Well, I look at what they did in the previous seasons when they clearly were a worse team than they are now. I think this team, this iteration of the teams that have missed the playoffs in the last few seasons, at least has a little bit more fight in them. They're in more games. They're not getting blown out every night. They still can't score or keep the puck out very well, but they're a little bit more competitive, especially when Reimer's in net. I think they might do some things like what they did when they acquired Jonathan Dahlin, Alexander Barabanov, some little trades like that might net them someone that they can give an opportunity to, and maybe they can flourish or at least show a little bit. Maybe garner some assets with picks. I don't know that they're going to want to trade someone like Jacob Middleton, who's been a bit of a revelation for them. He's very physical and played really well up and down the different pairings. And so he's someone they might hang on to. I'm curious to see what they do with Barabanov. He clearly wants to stay. He said that. But, I don't think he's a first line player on a good team. So it seems like the Sharks could get, a decent asset. And I just don't know that he fits into what they want to do long term. Like, is he really going to be a top 6 winger for them? He's a UFA. He showed really well. He'd fit really well on a competitor on a third or second line to add some scoring punch. So it seems like a team could possibly overpay, and the Sharks could take advantage of that.
I was going to ask you about Middleton. There's been a lot of talk about him and what the San Jose Sharks might get for him. He seems to have sort of come out of nowhere, signed an AHL deal, playing really well, playing top 4 minutes. Is attractive to a lot of teams, especially at that salary. What would it take for San Jose to move him, do you think?
Yeah, he's a playoff type defenseman. He's exactly what a competitor should want. And I think that it would have to be an offer that they feel like they couldn't refuse. So maybe like a middle to high end prospect, or maybe a second round pick and a middle prospect. I think that might do it. He is older. That's the thing that I would consider if I were the Sharks. He's a bit older. And he's an RFA, right? So how much of a raise is he going to get? Is this a Shimmick situation all over again, who looked really good for one season and then they signed him for a bit of term and he hasn't ever really looked the same? Of course, he had a knee injury, but Middleton plays that type of style, that rough and tumble style that may, get him injured, and maybe he doesn't able to produce like he is now. So that would be my concern. But it seems like they really like him. I think though, if a pretty decent offer came along, they would ship him out, especially considering people forget that Nikolai Knyzhov hasn't played all season and he was fantastic last season. So can he repeat what he did? Can Shimmick return to some bit of a form? And obviously Ferraro has been, really emerged as a top pairing guy there. So it seems like they shouldn't really need him, but they want to keep him, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but you raise a good point, though. If he turns into a fantastic player that is going to be on your team and in the top 4 for a long time, then you would be kicking yourself if you moved him. But if this is the 1 year where he plays the way he's played and doesn't ever do it again, and then you didn't move him and you could have got something, it's a tough spot to be in. And there's some teams that are facing this, but yeah, Middleton's one of those guys. All right. So my consensus here from all 3 of us is that all of these teams are probably not going to be terribly active. I hate to be boring radio, but I have a feeling the Edmonton Oilers are probably in the same boat. There's a lot of talk surrounding the Oilers. They need a goaltender. They could use an extra defenseman. I think their forward group is set now. The guys are coming back healthy. The only one they're missing is Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, but Puljujärvi comes back into the lineup tonight. They play Buffalo. Chris Russell's coming back off of long-term injury reserve. So they have a decent mix. I think their goaltending is still a massive question, but I don't believe that they're going to be doing anything about that. Ken Holland says he's not giving up a first. He's not giving up a second or a third. He's not moving any high-end picks. He's not really trading anybody off the roster. So I don't know what you can get on the goaltending market that's already pretty dry. And Marc-Andre Fleury is like your big get. You're certainly not getting them for a 4th round pick. So I don't imagine that the Oilers are going to be doing a whole lot. So unfortunately, I have to say that we're probably all with teams that are not going to be extremely active. That said, this might be the most fun part of this conversation in this segment for the Pacific Division is us looking at other teams. So there are some teams in this division that have already been a little bit active, that could be active again. I'll start with Matthew. Do you have a team that you're kind of keeping your eyes open for, that you're thinking it might be the team to watch here over the next few days out of this Pacific Division specifically?
Well, I mentioned it in the other divisions about Vegas, and that's a team I'm kind of looking at because of the fact of how much they've struggled in the last, they're on a 5-game losing streak. They're falling out of the playoffs fast. I mean, they're only a point up on Vancouver now. Their goaltending now, Leonard's out for a while. They're going to have to get some goaltending unless they want to have Brossoit be the guy going to the stretch into the playoffs, because I don't know if that's the best scenario for them. I think Vegas is going to be interesting to see what they can, if they look at kick tires on goaltenders, because they're going to be desperate for them, because with the team they've got added Jack Eichel, they're really loaded on offense and defense. It's their goaltending that's going to be a problem, and it's been a problem. So I think Vegas is going to be the one team to watch. Calgary's already made a couple moves. I don't know if they're going to be making any more. So yeah, Vegas is for me is the one to look at.
Let me ask you this. My impression of Vegas is that they build a team in a very interesting and I don't know, ideal way. If they don't make the playoffs this season, do you think it changes their perspective on how they construct their roster moving forward? Because this is a team that has bought from day one. They have spent countless dollars to grab every player that is a big name, and they've moved out big players for the newest flavor of the month. Yeah. And they do it over and over and over again. And these guys are cup or bust. So if they don't make the playoffs, does it change their way of approaching how they build this roster, do you think?
Well, I mean, yeah, like you said, they're an interesting team. The way they work and do business, it's, they kind of circumvent the cap, even though they're not circumventing the cap. They're able to add players. Like, I didn't think they would be able to add a guy like Jack Eichel, but they did it. And getting Pietrangelo, but they got rid of a guy to get him in. I mean, it's an interesting, they don't seem to have a lot of loyalty to players. I don't know. It's an interesting way of doing business. And I think it may change if they don't make the playoffs, because, that's the first time it's not worked. So I think, it'll be interesting to watch, not just now, but after this season, depending on what happens with them.
Yeah, I got to say, like, after that first season, and they've ditched most of the guys that helped them get to that cup run in the first, then there's no loyalty there. I'm kind of like, I get a little sour on Vegas in the way that they build their team now. Austin, what about you? Is there a team in the Pacific Division outside of Los Angeles that you're kind of keenly keeping an eye on here?
Yeah, Vegas definitely would have been there. The team I'm really keeping an eye on, though, is just down the freeway, the Anaheim Ducks. They've got some big pieces. They already moved Josh Manson out, and the big name coming from them is going to be Hampus Lindholm. I already mentioned the Trot trade, but I don't think anyone outside of Montreal was happier for that trade to go through than the Ducks, because that just jacked the price of Hampus Lindholm up so much. Cervelli reported today they're looking for a first-round pick, A-level prospect, and an extra asset, and it's not unrealistic to think they could get that based on what the market is set at right now. And if they get that, I mean, the rich get richer for their prospect pool. And then they've got other guys. Rickard Rakell's another piece that could get them something pretty good. I don't think it'll be quite the same kind of return. I think there's going to be a team, though, that maybe misses out on a Claude Giroux and panics and goes out and overpays for Rickard Rakell. And then also looking at some of their depth guys, Nick Delorier, he's not going to fetch you much, but he might get you something. And then there's a report today that Max Comtois might be available from them. And I think that's a guy who could also get you a big, big return. If I was a Ducks fan, I heard that they're shopping Comtois, I'd be pretty livid, because I think that's a great player. But if you're a team looking for a playoff type forward, that's a guy I'd really want. Big, fast, can score goals. So they're the big team I'm looking for from the Pacific right now.
We've seen it with Montreal that they've had a high asking price for a lot of their players, and they've been sticking to their guns on that. Do you think Anaheim does the same? Do you think that they have said, you know what, this is what we want from Lindholm. If we don't get it, we're not moving them. Same thing with Rakell, things like that. Do they stick to that high asking price, or do you think they're a team that just actively look at a sell, pick up what they can and move forward?
I think they could they'll probably drop a little bit on the Lindholm price. I don't think anyone's going to pay quite that much. I think they'll probably get a first round pick, maybe a B prospect and like a depth player, but even then that's a great return for them. I was listening to the Athletic Hockey podcast and they're talking about if with Trot, basically, if you keep saying that he's worth a first round pick, someone's eventually probably going to pay a first round pick. And I think that's kind of what the Ducks are going for with Lindholm. If they keep telling everyone this is what this guy's worth, eventually someone's just going to believe it and they're going to make the trade. We saw it work with Montreal, like you said, and I think they're going to try and do the same thing. I don't think it'll work quite as well for Lindholm because he wants an absolutely monster contract at the end of the year. It sounds like he wants kind of like a hurdle 8x8 kind of thing. And I'm just not sure teams are going to give up a huge haul for him and then also re-sign him for that kind of deal. So I think it'll come down a little bit, but they'll get a first round pick for him and a good prospect at minimum.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch what happens with him because if Chikrin's off the board, which we assume that he is, Lindholm might be the defenseman to watch here now. Victor, what about you? Is there a team outside of San Jose? We've kind of covered Vegas pretty well. Austin just ran into the Ducks, the team you're watching.
Well, I guess I'll go Seattle. No, I think Seattle is an interesting place as well. I probably would have said Vegas too, like Matt, just because they're falling out and maybe they could move some cap around and not necessarily throw in the towel, but get some assets back for some guys like Riley Smith. But let's talk about Seattle because they have a ton of cap space and they are clearly a bad team. So they don't have any delusions of making the playoffs or even necessarily being competitive in the next year or two. It seems like they've realized they need to collect assets, draft, and, have some young players. They also don't have any huge contracts. I mean, their biggest contract is their goalie, Philip Grubauer, who obviously has struggled, but has also shown that he can be good in front of a good defense, which he doesn't have. So, I could see some pretty good players going out. We already saw Young Croak go, and we could easily see some other decent roster players be moved out that don't have a super high cap hit and could really help, someone like a Giordano. Obviously he's a bit older and they are obviously willing to retain salary as they should. They could get some really nice assets and there aren't a whole lot of teams that are in that position that can retain money and are clearly out of the playoff picture and can give some pretty decent players that have playoff experience. All the guys on their roster clearly don't have experience in Seattle, but most of them have had playoff experience elsewhere. And so that could be really valuable for another team. And so I could see them being pretty active. They already have a decent number of picks in the next couple drafts. And I could see them just loading up on several more and building this through the draft.
Yeah, they are going to be an interesting team because they are willing to sell. They're willing to retain salary. They're willing to sign or go for probably some players in the offseason that maybe some other teams won't be in on because the asking price is going to be way too high from their agents and whatever. So Seattle's going to be a really interesting team to watch because I think they thought they had somewhat of a plan going in. That plan didn't really work too well. Their goaltending situation is going to be interesting. I don't know if they're going to keep both guys, so we'll see. I guess the downside of me going last here is that I get to pick up the pieces here. I'll go with Calgary. I am curious to see what they do. Matthew, I think you said it, that they probably are done because of their cap hit situation. And they've already made a couple moves, adding Tyler Toffoli, and then getting Yarncroc and stuff. But I'm curious. I mentioned it earlier in one of the segments that Sean Monahan's name is out there. And I'm very kind of curious to see if that happens. I don't know that it'll happen before Monday, but that tells me that if they're shopping him around, that they are looking to make one more splash. And I don't know what it is. I'm not sure if they're looking to add a defenseman or bring Giordano back or whatever they're thinking about doing, that if they require moving Monahan out to make that move, that Tree Living's not done. Whatever, he might be finished, but he doesn't want to be finished, right? Like that's what I'm getting the sense out of Calgary is that they were going for it. I will fully admit I was way wrong on Calgary at the beginning of the year. I did not think they would be this good. They were a good team and they got better with the additions that they made, and they are going to make a run and they're going to push hard to do whatever they can do to add to this team and try to get better. So it'll be interesting for me. If they have the ability to move some pieces out to make that one more move, I think they're going to try. And I don't know if they'll be able to pull it off because it's going to be hard to move cap around and stuff like that. But if they can find a taker for Monahan, then it should be interesting to see what they do. Because the second that trade goes down, if it goes down, just watch. There's going to be a big splash coming out of Calgary, right? So it'll be very, very interesting. All right, that's going to cut her off for the show, guys. This was our final division. I appreciate you coming in to talk the Pacific Division. This covers the entire 2022 NHL trade deadline. I've told everybody on the other segments that if you guys are up for it and we have your teams do some major moves here or make some major transactions, that we might bring you back afterwards to sort of talk about what happened and dissect them a little bit. So hopefully you guys are open to doing that. But for Matthew and Victor and Austin and myself, and by the way, you can check me out on Twitter at NHL_trade talk, because I love talking trades and rumors. That's what we do. So you're welcome to find me there. But thank you to all three of you, to everybody else who joined us on the show. For those of you that are watching, this was a precursor, hopefully, to a lot of action for the 2022 NHL trade deadline. For the Hockey Writers, have a fantastic one. Enjoy the trade deadline, and we'll talk to you after it's over.